Hi everyone, you're all very welcome to another session of the Digital Cultures webinar series, which is hosted in collaboration with NCAD Dublin and the Digital Hub. And today we're looking at machine vision, computer vision. And I think this is a particularly kind of significant topic right now, because we live in a world that's full of images that are made by machines for machines, from facial recognition technologies to automatic license plate readers and AI image categorization. And what's more, these new sorts of ways of seeing are being coupled to new kinds of ways of knowing or acting in the real world. So in this panel, which is bringing together in a really interesting way, actually, artistic practice and research, I suppose we're asking how machine vision is influencing contemporary visual culture, looking at maybe what kinds of biases or social differences are produced by these imaging systems, and asking, I suppose, how we might begin to start unpacking or understanding the kind of technological substrate of things like standards and protocols and training data sets and algorithms themselves that make up these seeing machines. And then secondly, maybe asking, how does artistic practice provide a space for interrogating these or for seeing different? So we have two really interesting speakers today, Rosa Menkman and Joanna Zylinska. So Rosa Menkman is a Dutch artist, theorist and curator, and a visual artist specialising in glitch art and resolution theory. So her work investigates video compression, feedback and glitches, using that exploration to generate artworks. But Rose also publishes quite widely around her work, so including The Glitch Momentum in 2011, which was published by the Institute of Network Cultures. And actually, I don't have it in your bibliography here recently, Rosa, but you have a new book as well, or a kind of a small book called, I think it's called the Resolution. Can you help me out?
Sorry, I'm on my phone, so unmuting is quite like a struggle. It's called Beyond Resolution.
Beyond Resolution, yeah. So those are available now, which kind of, I suppose, unpack some of her practice as well. But she's also, very, very well known for her artwork in glitch and resolution. So some well-known works would be the Vernacular file formats and artworks such as The Collapse of PAL and Xilitla. And currently she's interested in considering alternative ways for performative lecturing, which I'm kind of really excited to say you're playing around with in your talk for us today. Our second speaker then is Joanna Zylinska, who's also an artist, writer, and lecturer, and according to ImageNet Roulette algorithm, a mediatrix. Her art practice involves experimenting with different kinds of image-based media. She's the author of a number of books on art, philosophy, and technology, but probably most relevant to our discussion today, a recent book with Open Humanities Press, AI, Art, Machine Visions, and Warped Dreams, and then Non-Human Photography, which was published in 2017 by MIT Press. She works as Professor of New Media and Communications at Goldsmiths in the University of London, and she's currently researching perception and cognition as boundary zones between human and machine intelligence, while trying to answer the question, which is something maybe we're going to be teasing out today: does photography have a future? So for anyone who's new to the Digital Culture series, the way we've been doing it so far is playing short talks by our speakers one after the other without any Q&A, and then sort of reconvening afterwards on Zoom for some discussion and some questions from the audience. So if you have a question for the speakers, you can type it in to the YouTube chat and it will be relayed back to us in the discussion. So we kind of make an effort to answer and engage with all of your questions. But for now, I'm going to just kick off and play Rosa's video for you first, and then Joanna's. And maybe one of the speakers, you can give me a shout if anything goes horribly wrong with the audio, but hopefully it won't. Okay. Oh yeah, and just to remind us, I think you've all done it already.
It means not to be blind. But in this short presentation, Destitute vision. When considering what it means to see, we usually think about visual perception, which means having vision. It means not to be blind. But in this short presentation, I would like to contemplate if seeing really is equal to not being blind. Because I think in reality, seeing means to use lenses, It means to filter, to introduce and handle or accept blind spot. To truly understand and possibly control the complexities of seeing, human, machine, algorithmic or otherwise, we need to move away from the regime of the optical and its elemental, archetypal yet exhausted object that is the image. Instead of focusing on that image, we need to focus on what remains unrendered or unseen, what we are blind to. We need to extend our understanding of technologies of perception to let them probe and perceive blind spots. We need to ask what lies beyond the normal or limit experience. But what could be a tool for such probing? What could we use to expand our perception and in doing so, open new ways to see? Before I get into those questions, I'd like to first dive quickly into the wet mechanics of seeing. So, the visible spectrum is the portion of the electromagnetic spectrum that is generally observable by the human eye. Electromagnetic radiation is classified by wavelength, which goes from short to long, gamma rays, X-rays, ultraviolet, then visible light or the humanly visible window of light, which involves typically wavelengths from about 380 to 750 nanometers, finally followed by infrared, microwaves and radio waves. In a very simplified way, human vision is triggered by photons that cause excitation of certain structures in our eyes. On the blue side of our trichromat vision, the lens of our eye blocks out ultraviolet light, while on the other side of the humanly visible spectrum, which is beyond red light, infrared light is no longer detectable because it simply has too little energy. It doesn't activate the photoreceptors of our eyes. This is also why our eyes are simply not able to see X-rays or the radio waves emanating from our cell phones. We don't perceive these types of electromagnetic radiation because our lenses filter them out, or our eyes are just blind to them. Of course, in some sci-fi future, we could just mount antennas in our eyes and as a result see through the walls. But right now, 2020 vision still involves many forms of filtering and blindness. Let me take it one step further. Let's just momentarily consider how some creatures actually see the world. While humans are trichromats, mantis shrimp can perceive up to 12 channels of color and even detect polarized light. Snakes, such as pit vipers, can look into the infrared spectrum by using thermal imaging. And then I even haven't mentioned extra visual senses, such as echolocation or magnetoreception. So clearly, human senses of vision or perception are not without its limitations and blind spots. But while human vision involves limitations, artists, scientists and engineers work hard to extend our perception. We use computational strategies to create new visualizations for pleasure, explanation, evidence, prediction and exploration. And we use our tools to show that while encoding or decoding images follows certain protocological or imposed complexities set through standard affordances, in reality, data itself should be considered fluid. Let's just quickly listen to what a rainbow could sound like. Any piece of data can be manipulated into anything rather easily. And this is especially of interest because our senses read and process data in quite different ways. While our ears recognize patterns over time, our eyes can specialize at immediate scanning of a plane for irregularities or clusters. So what we hear is time-based, while what we see is space-based. Different senses can perceive, filter and learn from the same data set in entirely different ways. They give us access to different forms of pattern recognition. So this type of quite basic transcoding of data actually exists in many disciplines. From medicine to astrophysics, scientists tend to transcode a particular messenger. which can take the form of, for instance, light or gravitational waves or neutrinos, just to name a few of them, that then they sense or detect through a window, which can be a CCD chip, a scintillator, a magnet, etc. They then transcode and filter the collected data to become rendered into an image, data visualization, or a sound. So this is kind of like anything, it is a latent space. Of course, all of this is a very simplified kind of diagrammatic way to understand how this very complex machine of detecting works. But the point is that while data has the potential to be fluid or to be actually absolutely anything, the architectures through which it moves transform it, which often forbids or orchestrates its flows and presentations. I think, especially in the arts, the mysteries that this type of data alchemy can spark are useful in a battle against standardization. However, when the same or similar experiments are done time after time, these transcodings also change or ossify into some kind of folksonomy of noise, which happened when glitch art became a genre. So I think sometimes this type of work also can become regressive in itself. It kind of obfuscates instead of celebrates an inherent rheology of data. So this like fluidity of data. I use the term rheology here as a term borrowed from the realms of physics, or to be more precise, from mechanics, in which it's used to describe the flow of matter, primarily in a liquid state, but also soft solids or solids that respond in a plastic way. So a rheology of data advocates fluidity in our data transactions, but it also underlines the possible loss of knowledge that may appear when formatting or treating data as a non-fluid, brittle, or predetermined object. Keeping all of this in mind, during the past 6 years I've been working on a field I call resolution studies, which I've described in a little book titled Beyond Resolution. In Beyond Resolution, I conclude that resolution studies should not just involve considerations on how or why data is rendered in a particular way, but also what or who is compromised during the rendering of data. So resolution studies is not only about the effects of technological progress or the consequences of scaling. Resolution studies is the study of how resolution as a material witness can embed tonalities into digital culture. Standard resolutions can be useful determinations. They can function to make our everyday life run smooth. But their affordances also involve presumptions, which puts them by default at risk to preclude alternatives and to perpetuate harmful ways of running, listening, or understanding. Examples of this, for instance, can be found in algorithmically racist biases that have existed for over a century now in the histories of color test cards, but that seem to be perpetuated indefinitely. And here I think about Lena, which is the color test card for the JPEG compression, or Suzanne Vega's Tom Diner, which is a song that sits at the basis of the MP3 standard, or even the more recent adoption of biased data sets for training machine learning algorithms. So here a resolution study should pivot to researching the standards that could have been in place, but that are not. As a form of vernacular resistance, resolution studies intends to provide new or ambiguous resolutions, to provide tools to deconstruct, or as Hillel Schwartz calls it, design the image, and the algorithmic standard affordances that lie at the basis of the computational image. When the computational image is designed, we could get access to what Foucault describes as the limit experience, which is a type of action or experience that approaches the edge of living or its intensities and what is seemingly impossible. We need to move the limit of the image further into the impossible space. Okay, that sounds all rather dramatic, but I think actually involving a little bit of drama here is okay. So, this takes me to the impossible blob. The impossible blob is a tool I've been developing since my Collide at CERN residency, during which I had the chance to interview over 40 scientists from the fields of particle physics. I asked them, imagine you could obtain an impossible image of any object or phenomenon that you think is important, with no limits on spatiotemporal, energy, signal to noise or cost resolutions. What image would you create? The collection of impossible images I have collected so far is fantastic. The answers I received illustrate a diverse array in limits on resolution, impossibility, but also on technologies of what imaging can be itself. A preliminary categorization of impossible images would entail images that are impossible due to spatial or time or other types of resolution, images that deemed impossible in the past but that have become possible today, images that were possible in the past but that are no longer possible, images depending on speculation, disbelief or imagination, and images of objects that can only be inferred involving a substantial signal-to-noise bounty. Okay, so I organized this preliminary collection of impossible images in a low poly rendition of what I call the unquantifiable blob of impossible images. The blob, or binary large object, is home to the collection of impossible images that altogether illustrate the concept of impossible and its relationships with affordance, resolutions, and compromise. So the blob actually gives shape to the latent image space, the space of any and all images or renders, past and future, which in reality has become kind of a fragmented space of stacked, predetermined actions and affordances that consolidate into resolutions. Through my research into resolutions and the impossible image, I see there's a need to keep fragmenting the stacks of the computational image, especially when it comes to new images that are invoked by machine learning, such as, for instance, what Trevor Paglen calls the invisible image. So images created by opaque technologies that are actively looking, indexing, and processing us and the world around us. These are images that are not even made for humans, and they are often hard to be seen, not only because they are inaccessible or performed in the background of our computers, but also because they are made of metadata that is often not even humanly legible, understandable, or readable. As Rubinstein writes, the post or fragmented photographic image no longer needs to be formed by traditional images, because they are no longer representational. Because these images no longer follow the indexicality of the sign, they have become kind of photographic skeuomorphs. In a time of exploded or expanded photography, a time that recognizes that photography no longer needs to be representational, lens or light based, I think these theories of the exploded and expanded image can help us understand not only what the image is built of, but also what an image or what the latent image space can be. I think the latent image can be used as a tool to expand our perception, and in doing so, to offer us new ways to see. But it also offers us spaces we don't want to see or train in. And that's why I think we need to keep asking, what does the algorithm render invisible? What types of blind spots does the algorithm invoke? Instead of focusing on just the image, we need to focus on what remains unrendered or unseen. Because while all ways of seeing include blind spots, every algorithm introduces affordances that include restrictions to new or other ways of rendering. While our machines and algorithms may see more and more, we definitely suffer of destitute vision.
Coming from, I wanted to The title of my short presentation is Beyond Machine Vision. And by way of framing for you where I'm coming from, I wanted to say that I have a combined background in media philosophy and image-based art practice. So my talk offers a critical reflection on machine vision developed alongside an art project, a short video work called Neuromatic, which I made and which deals with the problem of machine and computer vision. To make the video, which is slightly over 6 minutes long and it has a voiceover and sound, I reanimated with the help of a big GAN algorithm available via Artbreeder, some historical and contemporary images of eyes and brains. The images were taken from the Wellcome collection, which is a repository of medical images in the UK. The idea behind this work was to raise some questions about perception unfolding between the eye, the brain, and the world in humans and machines. The video's title, Neuromatic, is a coinage of two terms, neuro referring to nerves or the nervous system, and matic, standing for something referring to the eye, which is mati in Greek, but also referring to matic as in automatic, willing to perform. So Neuromatic captures this link between the eye and the brain in the visual apparatus, but it also suggests playfully, provocatively, that vision itself can be understood in machinic terms. The problem of machine vision has been of interest to me for a long time. I recently published this short book titled AI, Machine Visions and Warped Dreams, and the PDF is available open access for free, so you can download it from the Open Humanities Press's website. And the book presents a polemic about different ways of viewing art at the time of the rise of machinic creativity driven by so-called AI. And I say there some rather critical things about GANs and about GAN aesthetics, where GANs stand for generative adversarial networks. But I've also relied on GANs to produce this video. So I'm not claiming that GANs or indeed any other AI-driven art algorithms or techniques are mindless or evil per se, but I want to suggest that a lot of AI art becomes much more interesting when it goes beyond mere aesthetics, when it encourages us to see otherwise, to unsee certain congealed sociocultural formations, when it pushes us to ask questions about the nature and structure of the world. The questions I wanted to raise with my piece in a more open-ended way than I do in my writing, which is more academic, were as follows. Can machines see? What does it mean for us humans to endow machines with the capacity for seeing? And what does it mean to classify as seeing their ability to differentiate between objects in the world on the basis of light reflected off them and transmitted to those machines' processors? But do we actually understand how humans see the world? And is there even a we that does the seeing? Are we, in fact, seeing machines? So you can say that the video is an invitation to deal with questions that computer science often deals with, but in a way that perhaps goes beyond many established paradigms in computer vision. And now some terminological qualification is perhaps in order when it comes to the distinction between computer vision and machine vision. So machine vision, as many of you will be aware, is a system engineering discipline that works on the automatic extraction of information from digital images to enable machines to perform tasks requiring human sight. Such tasks may include quality control, identification and verification, and can be applied in self-driving cars, security, or space exploration. Machine vision systems rely on cameras with sensors, processing hardware, and software algorithms. So machine vision contains computer vision, although the two terms, machine vision and computer vision, are sometimes used interchangeably. At present, the goal of machine vision is to imitate the way humans see the world, and also to learn how to see better, that is, faster and more efficiently than humans. However, in my work, I'm interested in exploring what it actually means to say that machines are capable of seeing. But I prefer to speak about machine perception than machine vision. And it's not just me, though. In recent years, many machine vision researchers have gone beyond the explicit focus on the eye to include other senses, such as hearing, touch, and olfaction. Expanding their data sources from images to sounds, music, and video, Google is now using the term machine perception instead of machine vision. But for me, what machine perception really needs is a shift of focus from the flatness of 2D images to the 3D environment which produces them. This more active and dynamic understanding of vision in terms of perception and movement departs from the definition of vision as proposed in the foundational text of computer vision by David Marr, published in 1982, in which vision was understood primarily as a problem of information processing. Marr assumed that the mechanism of primary visual processes, such as edge detection or binocular vision, was computational, and that it worked its way from those primary processes upwards, all the way to the brain. The notion of machine perception I'm using aims to address one of the key blind spots of computer vision today: its inability to fully account for how our brains actually work and how the translation process from retinal stimulation through to the neural circuits of the brain occurs while producing a sensation and an awareness of its sensation recognized in the form of an image that we see. So basically, no one quite knows how we see. We know a lot about the mechanics of seeing and about some individual neural processes, but how it's all put together and how it's experienced by us as seeing is still a mystery. So good luck with teaching machines how to see. Machines interpret images very simply as a series of pixels, each with their own set of color values. So my notion of machine perception aims to complicate the simplicity of this model and to explore a different way of what it might mean for machines to see or not see, as the case may be. But I also want to challenge the idea that the brain is the core organ of perception in humans. So bearing this criticism in mind, I want to turn to the following question. Is it possible to construct a perception machine? Now, this question was originally posed by biologist and Nobel laureate Gerald Edelman and his collaborator George Reek Jr. in their 1990 paper. Edelman and Reek's work was part of their wider project on the neglect of findings from evolutionary biology and AI research. The two researchers were criticizing AI scientists for remaining too bogged down in assumptions drawn, on the one hand, from the arguments of Alan Turing and Alonzo Church about the universal problem-solving capabilities of computers, suggesting that the brain may be understood as a computer, and on the other hand, from the reductionism of molecular biology, suggesting that the brain is just a collection of units that exchange chemical signals. So Edelman and Reek were also critical of neural network computing as an approach that promises to develop machine vision by modeling it on the operations of the human brain. The strictly computational approach, they argued, can't really tell us much about perception because of its foundational error, namely the belief that objects and categories already exist in the world out there, so humans or machines can just go and find them. But the world is much messier and much more complex than this. Recursive neural networks used in deep learning, which consist of layers of nodes, have partly addressed the problem of complexity. They've had significant successes in identifying patterns in imprecise data, for example, in applications such as face recognition, medical data analysis, or natural language translation. Yet neural networks, as currently conceived in AI research, still don't ultimately challenge the assumption that information exists in the world, while the organism is a receiver rather than a creator of criteria leading to information. Now, I'm particularly interested in Edelman and Reek's critique of the idea of objects and events existing in the world out there to be seen, grasped, and manipulated by us. As a response to computational schematism, they suggest that any viable theory of categorization and intelligence to be used in AI research needs to embrace the Darwinian model of selection, but adjusted for the working of neurons of a single organism operating during its lifetime. Now, this conclusion serves as the grounding for their 1990 paper about the possibility of constructing a perception machine. But Edelman and Rick's concept of the perception machine itself remains hamstrung by the aculturalism of their model, with machinic operations positioned as mainly driven by natural selection. So they dismiss the cultural transmission of information as irrelevant to the evolutionary development of perceptual systems. However, deciding which aspects of the surrounding can be classified as nature and which belong to culture is not straightforward. The construction of culture as a separate domain of uninheritable features will allow computer scientists to ignore embodied and embedded modes of perception and cognition. This disembodied model of computer vision results in the preservation of one of the biggest science and computer science myths: the belief that data bias, understood as cultural bias, once eliminated, will result in the data that is both pure and fair. We are regularly presented with consequences of such as an essentialization of biology and the brain at the expense of cultural traits in cognitive and computer science. Two recent examples include the video conferencing platform Zoom's background algorithm, which removed the head of a Black academic anytime he tried to use a virtual background, and the Twitter cropping algorithm, which always privileged the showing of white faces in cropped images in the timeline. While the computer vision machine reveals itself not to be particularly perceptive, the consequences of its racialized blind spots are anything but trivial. Indeed, the algorithms that run within it are the same ones that make decisions about people's social, financial, or legal status, including punitive action at border control, denial of credit, or assignation of criminality. While early Google image recognition algorithm was highlighted in 2015 to auto-tag pictures of Black people as gorillas, there is still a problem with face recognition of Black females, with a high false match rate explained by industry experts as a combination of the difficulty of lighting a Black face and the makeup worn. One factor is that the image databases that serve as training sets for the algorithms are not properly representative, being skewed in terms of volume and quality towards photographs of white males. But there is a deeper logic at work here, with a whole systemic infrastructure involved in the production of cameras, image processing software, and the visual and cultural training of photographers and image technicians that produces a particular set of internalized norms that can then be presented as posing an objective difficulty in taking a photo of a person with a dark skin. This mode of thinking, embedded in all sorts of technologies that precede the digital, is what Sophia Noble has described in her book Algorithms of Oppression, which analyzes the hidden operations of capital, race, and gender in algorithmic infrastructures as technological redlining. Suggesting that artificial intelligence will become a major human rights issue in the 21st century, Sophia Noble issues a call for us all to understand the architecture and logic of algorithmic decision-making tools in masking and deepening social inequality. She leaves us no illusion that algorithmic oppression is fundamental to the operating systems of the web. It is therefore not enough to just debias the data. Rather, we need to ask bigger questions about the forms of injustice embedded in the systems that host it. We also have to ask what it means when the elimination of the glitch, while desirable from a technical point of view, ends up making the punitive surveillance running on this data even more efficient. The correction of the data bias doesn't correct the violently penetrative and extractivist logic of the computer vision system. It actually strengthens it. So the question I want to leave you with is, can we do better than that? Thank you.
Thank you so much for such interesting talks. I think there's really, really interesting kind of crossover as well happening between the material that you're covering. I'm going to take the kind of opportunity to ask a couple of questions maybe before we turn it over to some of the audience questions. But when I was engaging with both of your talks there, I guess I kept thinking about you know, the issues you're bringing up around, I suppose, vision and the politics of various forms of computer imaging, computer vision and machine vision. I was thinking a lot about Niels Bohr's wave particle duality, you know, which Karen Barrett writes a lot about in Meeting the Universe Halfway. And I'm probably going to not do it justice here. But, you know, I suppose it's this, because I'm really bad at physics, but it's this idea, you know, that light is both a wave and a particle. So both of those conditions are true. Both of them are real in a sense, but depending on what kind of apparatus you're using, depending on how you actually view the light or how photons are resolved, I guess, to use Rosa's term, it might be a wave or a particle, you know. And it's such a powerful experiment because it's demonstrating how, as both of you are arguing, I guess, that while these processes aren't subjective, they're also not, there's no kind of raw or objective data either, you know, that's kind of waiting out there to be observed. So all of our technologies observing have these particular kinds of shaping effects. And that has an impact then, of course, on how we're visualizing data in terms of how we image or how we see. And I guess I find this idea really, really fascinating and really productive, but also a little bit overwhelming, because it seems to kind of suggest that, you know, or problematize, I guess, representational practices, evidentiary practices. And I wondered, with both of you being artists, maybe, what space do you think art has to kind of, I guess, to kind of maybe challenge or question or make visible the apparatuses, the things that are kind of pushed to the sides, the things that we can't see? And that's a question for both of you. A difficult question, maybe.
I can start off my own perspective on this. I think art has many spaces or many reasons to exist, right? I think almost there's as many reasons and spaces for art as there are artists. So it's rather hard to give a sufficient answer to that. However, I see two main things. One thing is that, like, the science that scientists make, right? They don't make it just for the sciences. They want to open up their knowledge to an audience bigger than just the scientific community, because that is actually, you know, it's, you know, you want to grow the science, but you also want to be able to share it and to get this knowledge is not just for sciences alone. So artists are often a bridge in there, or they can be, I guess. I had another perspective. I just lost it for a second. So maybe, Joanna, you want to add something to that first?
I suppose for me, that's I'm interested in kind of more networked, collaborative, horizontal kind of forms of art that is also exercising its paragonal function, which is to say it's a paragon from art history as the framing. Traditionally, it was the frame of a painting, but also we could think of it metaphorically as a kind of discussion, debate, discourse, analysis, engagement, critique, all sorts of other things that happen outside or around the art piece. And that kind of, so I think that paragonal function of art is, and especially with regard to those kinds of art pieces that speak to quite new, quite recent, quite controversial developments, such as, for example, machine vision, machine perception, I think can exercise this function. But also for me, the interesting thing is that, you can deal with the same themes and topics that, you know, engineering teams, science teams are dealing with, but the end point of the projects is often very different. Although I do realize that some high-end science, which is more blue skies, which is not tied into, you know, the kind of grants competition and achievements and the classification of metrics and the research university, is also functioning on that abstract kind of plane as much as a lot of art is. A lot of science is, through the nature of its funding and institution, driven by a much more kind of instrumental set of questions and parameters, and we can add, you know, non-governmental agendas or capitals agendas. So I think artists can come at the same field or domain, if you like, with a different sort of questions and with certain lack of goal, if you like. And can also, the artists can afford through their profession and I'm using profession very loosely here, they can afford to play, to break things just for the sake of, you know, seeing where this gets us. So that it's almost a certain playfulness, yet a no attitude as a part of the modality of dealing with some very serious stuff is something, you know, it's a different mode, if you like, of expression, of interrogation. And because I do both, I do kind of a lot of academic things that are more recognizable as academic research, not scientific, but, you know, humanities scholarship around these things. So I already see different affordances between scholarly writing and analysis, exegesis, and what kind of artistic practice. There are similarities, but there are also, you know, spaces and ways of doing things, allowing to do things differently.
I find that really interesting in your talk, Joanna, when you made that sort of distinction. I guess at one point when you introduced your work, you sort of made the point that this allowed you to do something slightly different or slightly more open-ended. And something I was thinking about while watching your videos is you both, I suppose, point to these kinds of transdisciplinary practices. And I don't mean that even in terms of, you're both incredibly transdisciplinary because you're working across art and academia, but you both actually gestured towards moments where you were also working quite closely with scientists. So Rosa mentioned what sounded like a really interesting residency working with particle physicists. And I loved those unseen, you know, or what are they, unimaginable images that you had. And then Joanna, you mentioned working with Wellcome Trust images. You were engaging very deeply with historical papers from computer vision. So it's clear that you got a lot of interesting information. And I feel like sometimes when we have these discussions in art spaces, we sort of talk about all the interesting things that art can sort of teach the scientists, you know, that we're sort of saying it's really interesting that we're bringing this sort of critical lens, or, you know, that we're kind of troubling the idea of kind of objective knowledge and so on. But I was curious, like, what did you guys learn? Did you learn any sorts of ways of critical thinking maybe that then you brought back to your artistic practices or to your humanities practices from engaging with that work? So it's a, I mean, yeah.
Yes, which one, Rosa? Do you want to go first? Or?
I mean, I was first the first time, so you can go first, second.
Okay. I mean, because, for example, to be working with things like, you know, be it GAN algorithms or be it even machine vision or human vision. I mean, I had, even though I do have a biology A level, but that's very kind of remote past. So I had to, you know, relearn and reteach myself and understand some of the science behind it. And that's kind of, that's interesting in itself. And obviously seeing then the connections between a lot of the philosophical questions that get asked around it, the foundational assumptions that get into it, but to actually then engage, be it in a kind of critical labor of exegesis or in creative practice, you just need to make sure you kind of understand that thing. So that is obviously the first point of understanding, but also there is something else that happens, because you can also see the similarities between disciplines in opposing questions, but you also see the differences in blind spots. And because being trained in the humanities, in kind of literature and philosophy, I think I can I've been trained in analyzing kind of discursive blind spots, saying what is not being seen. And obviously the idea of a blind spot, and Rosa very interestingly talks about those blind spots and probing them, you know, what in her talk. But it's something that I'm kind of interested in, how different disciplines and different modes of inquiry and different fields and different practices have different blind spots. So maybe by putting all of these in a conversation, obviously it's at least casting light on one blind spot when speaking from another perspective. And that is, and I don't have a fantasy of creating some kind of universal knowledge at all. And I'm becoming much more aware of my own blind spots in all of this as well. But kind of seeing them, highlighting them is maybe as much or as little as I can do through this work.
Yeah, I think for me, a lot of my practice was always already critical, but with critical, I don't think necessarily just about criticizing anything, like whether that's like, in this case, we're talking about biases or blind spots. It's also by bringing the subject that you're researching, whether that's a scientific or a more cultural subject, by bringing it kind of in this critical state where you're trying to probe it from the side that there are not necessarily tools for yet. So I think what I found very, very beautiful at CERN was that I came there with this language that was, for me, it was a very poetic language. It was made out of metaphors. And I had to reevaluate my choice of language. I needed to I had a research question which was about shadow knowledge, and I wanted to ask about what types of shadows or blind spots, like the liminal spaces of the practice of the particle physicists there were. And they could not get into that conversation with me because they wouldn't use that type of language. But for me to learn, and I had a really great time with two advisors, I rewrote the question, which I presented also in the video. But by going into the language of another discourse, but then pulling that kind of language back to my own research and my own, field, I think I did really shake kind of the space in which these people also had to think. And it also gave me really new ways, I think, things that the conversations became very new, and I had a lot of very, I think it opened up a lot for me, at least. So for me, that was a really critical, eye-opening space.
I think, what you're pointing to both is that, I suppose, that really interesting thing of disciplinary language as well. I did my PhD in an engineering department actually was on radio spectrum, but it was all, that there was always that sense that, like, if you could kind of acquire enough language, I guess, within that space to have a productive conversation, then things could really happen. I'm noticing we have a couple of interesting questions here in the chat. One from Nathan Jones about sort of vision. I was going to roll it actually into a sort of a question I had for you guys as well, where I was thinking about, when you were speaking, both of you at different points, I suppose, about different kinds of imaging technologies and maybe how we're moving away from this sort of idea of kind of images being kind of lens-based. So I started thinking about like Tesla and the way, I don't know if you guys have seen that, Tesla has a kind of a bird's eye view that it can produce of the car, which isn't produced even from cameras, obviously, because there's no way of having a camera like that above the car, but it's kind of interpolated, I guess, from different kinds of rangefinders or, sensors located around the car. So we have these kind of new sorts of forms of vision and sorts of forms of images that, can't be produced by humans, and that rely on things like that are much closer maybe to things like echolocation. But Nathan Jones is asking, is vision a kind of a privileged perceptive capacity or just a useful metaphor by which we understand inputs and effects? So I guess maybe I'll leave you guys to try and interpret that yourselves, but I would understand it as, I guess, being when we speak about vision now, we're speaking about, I suppose, all of these different kinds of forms of physical computing, I guess, of input and output.
I think vision definitely has been privileged, especially in the West. I think it's one of the most dominant ways of how we perceive the world. I really liked what Joanna did in her talk, where she makes a very clear distinction between vision and perception. Perception being the broadened field that I think, as she also says, Google already adopted that term. So it's like machine perception, I believe is what you said. Mm-hmm. I think we are getting to a point also in images, and the new work by Alan Warburton, RGB FAQ, which you can see a little bit of it online. I think it's still open at Arbeit Gallery. It's a beautiful video essay in which he kind of expands or opens up the computational image, and he opens it up towards he says it's like this dual apparatus. It's on the one hand, it's like made out of computer vision, and on the other hand, we have computer graphics. And he brings them really interesting together at the end of his talk. But in the middle, he explains how computer graphics are no longer just 2D in the sense that we're using all these render elements that already give layers. He calls it like the exploded image, or I think it's like the hyper image when it's rendered, and the exploded image if you take all the little render elements apart. So that can be, for instance, the depth map that you're talking about, or it can be the glossiness, or it's like all these different types of elements that give metadata to the actual 3D image that can then be rendered through that. And so I think what we see is that where we used to understand images just as 2D planes, right? Images themselves, and that's also where Ellen kind of like steers the video essay towards, these images, even older images, like the images that Joanna has used in her video from this old archaic medicine book, or I don't know, archive.
Yeah.
Archive.
They are now becoming kind of more than 2D, because we're starting to kind of interpret them with our machine learning algorithms. New information gets layered into them. And so I would say that vision was once privileged, but now what is happening actually, I think, is that images or vision is no longer 2D just because it's kind of co-opted by these machines, even when it was not made by these machines or for these machines at first. And so it's no longer 2D, it's already possibly everywhere 3D once it gets to these machines later.
Yeah, and to just return, I agree with everything Rosa's just said. So I'll just add to it very briefly, but to also return to Nathan's question, whether it's vision just a metaphor. So I think it's something stronger than that, for reasons that Rosa has explained very well. We also have to remember that no matter, whether we realize or not, and many of us do now, that vision is just one of the senses, and that vision is never just vision, because it's always already expanded, it's environmental. Vision has always been haptic, for example. And yet at the same time, the human has been constructed as a kind of visual being, as a being that constructs knowledge as well through vision. So that kind of epistemological and ontological relationship of the human and through the kind of visual apparatus, and also through its anchoring in this ray of light, Jonathan Crary analyzes in the techniques of the observer very well. So there is a certain history to both vision and the human as a kind of visualizing, seeing subject that also produces knowledge in that way. So that history also requires a certain mode of address from us. And even though, of course, there is a certain opening, rendering of things in 3D, but in a way, that process has existed before computer renderings. Like, in a way, we've been in the world, we've been grasping, perceiving. And what I've been trying to do with that, with this talk, which is part of a bigger research project, is also deal with the idea, which is, quintessential question: do things exist in the world, or do we produce them? Do they emerge only when we see them? It's Bishop Berkeley's question about trees in the forest. And this idea of, so in a sense, for me, we probably do produce them through particular modes of perception, but we also need certain languages as well. So stuff exists in the world out there anyway. Things don't just come into being only because we've seen them. Stuff exists, for me at least. I do believe that it exists. However, stuff exists as something. It's constituted through a particular, and gets names and gets boundaries and becomes a set of objects only through a particular cognitive, perceptive knowledge acts.
This actually, we've lost Rosa, but I'd say she'd probably pop back in a minute. But this kind of, both what you and Rosa were saying there, I suppose, a minute ago, kind of, hi.
With an angle, but
you're sideways, nice. But it's, yeah, it's quite nice. I was just saying, Rosa, I guess you were both raising issues in your talks about how machine vision systems have these selective blind spots. So, they're systemically biased, and then they're often used in these kinds of highly sensitive systems or highly, problematic places like security or border control. But you're both, I suppose, speaking about these different sorts of maybe ways of seeing. And I wondered, something I've been wondering a bit kind of when I was looking at machine vision for an issue we recently edited for Neural was, was there a possibility, I suppose, for resistance in these systems and finding some kind of some kind of space where machine vision and human vision sort of part company. So I actually just pulled it up there because I feel like it explains it way better than I can. I'm going to actually share my screen for 2 seconds. You're probably familiar with this GIF of this turtle, this one. I don't know if you've seen it. It says classified as a rifle at any angle. So it's like, I think these were Google researchers, where they've slightly modified the shell of this mock turtle in order to make it show up as a rifle to a machine vision system. But obviously to any human looking at this, it's very clearly still a turtle. We're not fooled for a second. What I really love about these experiments, or I suppose various different kinds of obfuscation projects like CV Dazzle, it's a project where the designer has made kind of face jewelry, I guess, to kind of obfuscate machine vision, or something like Algorithmic Justice League's drag versus AI workshops. All of these are sort of techniques that try and, they're inserting noise back into machine vision, or they're trying to sort of find that space where like human vision and machine vision kind of part company. And I guess I'm interested in whether is this kind of trying to identify where this space exists. Is that kind of a space for productive forms of resistance to machine vision?
But it's also showing a certain kind of parameters of within which machine vision functions. Yeah. And presumably because the goal of it isn't just, okay, so we'll make this art to make machine vision better in the long term. The goal is to show, the foundational assumptions, if you like, of machine vision. And as I tried to do, which, in the current schema is computational, basically, but there are obviously other theories now emerging from phenomenology, from other kind of modes of looking at the world that could come up with more complex, although inevitably more difficult to achieve forms of perception. So I think in terms of resistance could be one way, and I think art could do that, as in a way, you could kind of hack metaphorically some of these technologies to get them to unwork themselves. But also I think there is some kind of, again, casting light to play with these metaphors on the ultimate impossibility of the ambition behind some of the computer vision, machine vision projects, because their foundational assumptions are found wanting. And I think art can, in a way, do that, kind of gently probing, at the very foundations, if you like. So to see, what's at the core and why some of the promises that usually come to us, kind of bedazzling us with the new bright future, how they they won't come true, they won't happen.
This seems to be something I'd recognize these kinds of ideas, I suppose, coming through your work, maybe particularly your work in Glitch, Rosa.
The resistance, sorry, this phone, I'm in a weird setup today.
It's okay. You're okay.
You mean resistance in Glitch, but my problem with that is that you saw it also in that fantastic project CV Dazzle, but of course what happens is that, and Joanna just said that also,
yes,
sometimes CV Dazzle, for instance, machine detection algorithms learn from these technologies or these resisting art practices and actually co-opt that. And I think what you saw with Glitch, and I also spoke to that a little bit, is that resistance just gets co-opted either way. I mean, I'm not negative about it because artists will find new ways to resist, but I do not think like any kind of resistance most usually gets washed out, let's say. Yeah, and that's what happened with Glitch also. It just became a genre with different types of linguistics embedded inside of it. So this like breaking of flow or breaking of the norm or resisting the norm, it just became its own type of language, normative language. I think that's actually beautiful. Yeah.
No, I thought it was really interesting. Yeah, as you say, you picked up on Joanna was kind of speaking about the Glitch in particularly that way. I'm sorry if you can hear my 4-year-old in the background. He's running up and down the corridor screaming. I just see here we have maybe kind of a disciplinary kind of specific question, which I might leave for a minute. But I was very interested, I guess, in this sort of question that Joanna, you had in your kind of your bio, where you were asking kind of is some version of is photography over? And I guess I wondered if you had any kind of sense or kind of answer for that yet.
Well, the question that I'm kind of playing with, does photography have a future, is kind of riffing on Flusser's question, which is let me just pick this up from, does writing have a future? And we see Flusser, in a way, a philosopher of technology who is very fond of technology as a fundamental kind of mode of humans to come into being. And he's talking about technologies in a long historical kind of time scale, answers that question in the negative about writing. And I'm kind of building on this and looking at, can we pose a different question? Because writing, I don't know. I think the jury is still out, but moving to the technology of photography because of all the developments that I think Rosa's talk so beautifully and her work generally illustrated, all the formats in rendering, the impossibility to tell the difference between the kind of indexicality of the original, whatever that is, and the production of something based on the common knowledge of fantasy of an object that maybe has never existed as a singular object. So all of this, and that question, does photography have a future, is worth posing because it asks of us, well, it asks a whole lot of other questions about our modes of, how we construct knowledge, the role of visuality today, what is truth, and how truth and post-truth are constructed. So the question for me, in case you are interested, what I think about why I'm posing it and where I'm going with this, that yes, photography definitely has a future, although it might not end up looking like photography very much in the end. That doesn't bother me, but also I don't have a lot of money invested in the old Cartier, Bressons and old Ansel Adamses. I don't run an old style photographers gallery. There is lots of photographers galleries that are doing a lot of exciting work, kind of precisely twisting and playing with that question and the medium of that. So I think the reposing of the question, and we can see it today in the work of many artists like Rosa, but also, theorists and artists like Trevor Paglen or, Manovich with his work around. And on the recent panel, Manovich said that photography is young again. And I'm very much in agreement with that.
That is so funny. Oh God, yeah. No, I mean, I totally think that it's true though, but the problem for me, it becomes almost a linguistic issue, is like how, or a technological, but like kind of like in the middle there, like what is photography? Like, is that a lens-based medium or not? Because actually, if I was just looking to the side, because I moved. So the reason that all of this is so a little bit like kludgy is that everything is a mess. But next to me are my books that I am using right now. And although I am very ashamed of it because they are 3 white men, I will show you right now. It's photography from Turing Shroud to the Turing Machine, fragmentations of the photographic image, and then there's photography of the scale.
Oh, yes.
Those are 3 books that of the 15 books that are lying right next to me. They are all about photography, and they are all trying to expand or fragment or explode or break up classic photography and lens-based or indexicality of the photographic image and revision that into 21st century. I think whether or not photography is young, the way we define and approach photography is definitely changing. And I don't know if that's like I would pivot away from saying it's a linguistic issue towards saying we are just really re-understanding or defining the technology that is photography. I think that's exciting.
Yeah. There's a very interesting question here as well, which I think, really again relates to both of your work, even though it's actually kind of responding to something in Rosa's talk. But obviously, Joanna has a very interesting book from 2017, Non-Human Photography. So Agnieszka is asking, in Destitute Vision, Rosa mentions animals seeing differently from humans. I love those examples. Do you think this perspective of the non-human other can expand our understanding of machine vision?
Well, we have to, even like if we have like a little shroud of dignity of ourselves being part of a bigger world, then we need to understand that we're constantly blasting all kinds of stuff through the ether that other creatures, trees, I don't know, all kinds of receptive creatures can actually sense. So I would say absolutely. It's very interesting. I'm working together with Sarah Grant, who is working together with partner Danya.
Silly.
Yeah, oh, I not got to that name. Amazing. So Danya and Sarah, they're working on these like plant or tree antennas. So because they couldn't put antennas in the environment, they were just building tree antennas, and they were actually doing research on how with plants you can actually perceive the sun, radio waves, etc. So I would say it's what we should be considering. If we won't, then we're actually not inconsiderate, let's say.
Yeah, and if I can add to this, because absolutely, I think we do. But I think we should also ask why we are doing this. So if we are going to do this precisely to understand the limitations of our own conception of vision, and that we also see, we only actually see sharply what's in front of us. The rest is loses color, the rest loses sharpness. Other species, see in, some of them render things differently. Some have more kind of degrees of freedom in the movement of their visual apparatus. So there's all these different things happening. However, you can very easily see a company doing computer vision and saying, okay, great. So let's put together all these different species to make computer vision even better. So if you are kind of expanding all this and this understanding of perception and vision to look at other species, to see it a certain way of cutting to size human hubris in terms of creating that kind of grand vision of the world, the way you were describing that kind of the Tesla image, camera image from above, this kind of view from nowhere that really brings together this absolute visuality from every perspective and tries to capture the world. So I could already see some kind of corporations saying, excellent, let's just put together one species on top of another, kind of merge it all and have this super vision that, goes beyond the human. And you've got a hawk and a, lots of other, an ant and dog and a human. And, we can sell more stuff at the end of it because our missiles will be much better this way. But if you take it as an artistic, speculative, philosophical thing with a very different goal, as in to cut to size our own human desire to see the world from every angle and to own it in that way, that would be helpful. But again, you could see that being kind of remonetized all too quickly.
Maybe this relates a little bit as well to, I kind of wanted to ask you a question about, so one of the books I have beside me at the moment is AI Art. And so that's Joanna's latest book with Open Humanities Press. But it's quite interesting, actually, because the talk you gave today is kind of just one kind of small little, element of this. And actually, there's quite a lot of other things being engaged. And one of them, I suppose, was this idea of kind of machine creativity, I guess, and our understandings of, what constitutes creativity and in what ways kind of machines might be creative. And yeah, I don't know. I guess I started thinking about this artist duo. I'm going to say their name wrong now. Shinsun Bak Kim Young Han. They're a Korean duo who make a lot of work about machine vision. But one of the works, or some of the works, deal with this idea, I suppose, of almost like, instead of kind of forms of recognition on the parts of machines, they're almost dealing with things like playful, nonlinear, or lateral misrecognition. So they have a piece, I think, where they have computers kind of recognize things in clouds, a bit like humans do. And I guess I wondered, should we be sort of approaching or looking for a model or an imaginary of kind of machine creativity or machine dreaming then in kind of our vision?
Probably. I mean, as say, one of the artists whose work I kind of found intriguing with regard to this is Portuguese artist Leonel Moura, who does this kind of co-creation with robots and does these paintings in robots. Again, what for me was interesting is this paragonal function of art, where he kind of talks about what that he actually creates with these robots, but he also resigns from that role of the artist as this masculinist ego that stands up above the world and produces ex nihilo, kind of from nothingness. So that kind of recognition of co-creation. So in a way, you don't need to co-create with robots. I mean, lots of, through history, lots of artists, I mean, most artists have always created with people, a lot of them with their wives who provided infrastructures for their whole kind of successful functioning. But, people, produce work in the whole net of human and network of human and non-human forces. So the recognition of that, and a lot of creativity, even human creativity, has been machinic, has been automatic through history. I mean, obviously surrealists have made it visible through automatic writing, through art produced on drugs or through viruses and through all sorts of things. So that recognition that any form of creation, but even theoretical philosophical writing, sometimes I'm very aware it happens somewhere between my head, my fingers, my keyboard, somewhere I kind of write to figure out what I actually think. So that sense of this distributed creativity, which is partly automatic, is something that is of interest to me. But I don't think we need a kind of AI to exercise this for us. And in some sense, some of the developments that have taken place in a way have around artificial intelligence, even I think have shown very often a lack of imagination and lack of creativity, especially those that have gathered a lot of attention in the media, like a computer that paints like Van Gogh, wow, and or Microsoft making us a new Rembrandt because we haven't got enough Rembrandts.
I would like to add also something to this. What it made me immediately think of this question was the work of Holly Herndon, right? She made this artificial intelligence called Spawn with which she performs together. And from a talk of hers, if I got it correctly, she says like one of the more important parts of that particular software that she works with and the compositions that she creates with that software is that she always still needs to curate. She needs to make the choices of what she wants to let in and keep out of the composition. So she uses it as a tool of collaboration. But then what is an important question to her are two things, actually. It's the role of inspiration and the role of influence, like who has influence where and what parts are coming from what types of data sets, etc. So I think in that sense, it's much more interesting to see how the collaboration between human artist and machine algorithm, artificial intelligence, whatever it is, how they make you pose very rudimental questions about your artistic practice. Like you have to revisit what it actually means to create, what steps you're doing, etc.
I think what you're kind of pointing to actually really reminds me of the first one of these sessions we did was on translating nature. We had an artist, Julie Freeman, who her work is all about, translating nature, I guess, using data, but very much kind of making clear the kind of subjective decisions that she's making with the data, a bit like you mentioned there with Holly Herndon. I'm just aware we have kind of a big stream of kind of comments and things here, and I just wanted, I guess, even just to nod to some of them, even though there's a little bit of a bit of latency, I guess, in discussions and then some of the comments we're getting, but just some interesting comments here. Let's see. Nathan Jones, was asked that kind of very interesting question about kind of relationships between visuality and photography, saying, I feel like photography is probably experiencing the kind of existential crisis as an art form that painting and literature have faced in the past. And Claire Redelman is asking, if photography is mutating into a medium that no longer relies on lenses or even light, how do we even understand its relationship to the real and the political in the context of capitalism? And I think we had a sort of question.
I love that question. Can I say one thing to that?
Thank you.
You should visit the WordPress photo and the rules of what can and cannot be a photo. Because that to me is such a you see, I don't think there's one description of photography anymore. And if WordPress photo is the authority some people believe they are, then there's a whole lot of like poetic freedom taken. The WordPress photo basically has like, you cannot use any editing. You can only use like this and this amount of grading, etc. It's hilarious. So I just wanted to say that.
That's
but also when we think about the history of photography, I mean, it's like Fox Talbot's kind of direct, cameraless photography has been from the outset one of the kind of constitutive formations of photography, where you just put things on a photosensitive paper, and or Daguerre's kind of fossils and things. So the cameras or lensless photography has been a part of photography since its inception. And in a way, through what I tried to show, then taking this idea and a non-human photography, expanding it back to fossils and thinking about fossils as photographs, as ways, but also thinking through, lots of other kind of thinkers and borrowing ideas from other people about, changes to substrates, such as tanning, for example, as a form of light imprinting itself on a surface, and tanning as a form of photography. So you can think about this in a much more expanded way. And obviously, because I don't run World Press Photo or Sony Photo Awards and any of that, and because through the due to the nature of my role and my profession, I'm allowed in a way to break rules and conceptually conceptual categories to ask other questions. I'm aware it's a privileged position conceptually to do that, but I'm interested in breaking these rules and posing these questions precisely because they allow us to revisit histories of images and also to look at the current moment and to go back to Nathan's and Claire's questions about, I think photography is mutating into something now. And I think in the context of capitalism, so even though I'm saying, well, it's always been like this, there is obviously something happening at the moment as a result of all this kind of rendering, the almost impossible differentiation. So you can have all these rules that you like, but I'm sure it's still possible to cheat. And even the best photo editors at World Press Photo won't be able to tell, because if you can edit an image, you can also edit the metadata and the kind of layers of code to make it look like it's unedited. So you get into these rabbit holes and loops of truth and falsehood, of truth and creation, to actually depart from that kind of very anxiety about can we really model and represent the world? And then we go back to the question, is there a world to represent? Is it just out there waiting for us to represent, or is something else occurring? But the question around capitalism and around other kind of cultural formations, so the anxiety about painting and literature, that Nathan mentions, there were also anxieties around not just those very genre, but other forms of subjectivity and forms of, early capitalism, forms of bourgeois subjectivity that emerged at the time, and they were being either conserved or undermined through these media. And I think the same is happening perhaps with a kind of, more fluid, kind of accelerated, enhanced kind of high neoliberal capitalism of the data flows, that photography is playing both a role in it, but also unlodging some forms of truth, some forms of kind of welding around that. So I think that's why that question around photography, for me at least, it's not just that's photography of a future. It is not just a question about photography. It's a question about us as subjects who are produced with photography, produced by it, and who are constantly producing images and being produced by them. And that kind of socio-political consequences of it in the current moment is what really kind of interests me. So anyway, thanks for all these very thought-provoking questions. They're great.
That's a fantastic answer, Joanna. I really like how you're saying, basically, if I understand correctly, you're saying it's not necessarily all about the technology, but it's about the subjecthood, the user, and the one that is being used, that are completely changing and making our understanding of photography different. Yeah, I love that. Just wanted to say that.
I actually think it's a really maybe nice point to finish on, because I've just realized we've gone quite a bit over time. And I wanted to really thank you both, not only for your amazing talks and the time you put into those, but for your really, really interesting conversation and answers. Yeah, thank you so much. And big thanks as well to Anne in the gallery, who's managing all of the streaming and the questions and everything. And thanks to all of the people who've tuned in and who are asking questions. And sorry, I think in one or two cases we kind of moved quite a bit on from something when a question came in. So I think we didn't kind of get to all of the questions this time. But thank you so much for engaging with us. Okay.
Thank you also. Thank you, NCAD and Rachel and Anna.
Yeah.
And Joanna.
Yes, and Rosa. Thank you, everyone.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Oh.